Hello friends and welcome back. Today we'll take a look at the very first official classical game ever played between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. This particular game was played at the European U12 Championship in 2002. At that time, both players were just starting their climb to the top of the chess world. Carlsen's rating was 2214, while Nepomniachtchi was slightly higher at 2306. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment. In this game, Ian had the white pieces and started with e4, the king's pawn opening. Magnus replied with nf6, entering the Alekhine defense. Already as a kid, Carlsen loved experimenting in the opening and wasn't afraid of sharp positions. The game continued e5, knight d5, nf3, d6, d4, d takes e5, h takes e5, g6, bishop c4. Here we can see Nepomniachtchi's aggressive style. He develops the bishop to c4, eyeing the f7 square, and is already thinking about ideas like queen f3, attacking both f7 and the knight on d5. White could have also played c5, driving the knight further away, and then c4 to occupy the center. The knight on b6 and the pawn on d4. Black calmly plays c6, reinforcing the knight. White continues with knight c3, keeping up the pressure on the center. And already here, Ian sets a little trap for Magnus. Capturing that knight in the center would be a huge mistake, since it would allow a one-move checkmate on f7 with the bishop. Of course, even back then, Magnus had sharp tactical vision. Instead, he played bishop e6, simply supporting his knight on d5. After white castles, black retreats with knight d7, and the queen jumps out to queen f3, once again eyeing the f7 square. At some point, white could even consider capturing on d5 with a pawn gain. Magnus, after carefully calculating, develops his bishop to g7. And it turns out there was no real capture on d5 after all, or rather, no way for white to actually win a pawn. Here's why. If white tries it, black first exchanges on e5, and suddenly the white queen is under attack. White has to recapture on e5, but then comes bishop d5, followed by queen d5, queen e5, and we just get a series of trades. In the end, there's no pawn advantage for white. Everything simply equalizes. But in the actual game, after bishop g7, Ian decided not to take the knight. He realized that because of the capture on e5, the line wouldn't work. Instead, he played rook e1, reinforcing the knight on e5. After black castles, the queen retreats to g3. At this point, there aren't really any direct attacking ideas against the black king. The move is more flexible. Maybe white just wants to bring the knight back to f3 and settle for a small advantage in the center. But Magnus doesn't allow it. He takes on e5, and after white recaptures with the pawn, the black knight captures on c3. White replies with queen takes c3, avoiding doubled pawns. Then comes the exchange of bishops on c4, and white fails to gain anything from the opening. Magnus has defended everything, and now black holds a slightly better position. The bishop on g7 is much stronger than the passive bishop on c1. At least the black bishop is actively controlling the diagonal. Magnus plays qd5. Endgames have been his thing since childhood. He's always handled them extremely well. Now, for example, if white were to capture on d5, black could simply recapture, and although white would keep the pawn on e5, there's nothing dangerous here. Most likely, the game would just head toward a draw. Ian decided not to trade queens, preferring to keep a bit of initiative. He retreated his queen to e2, supporting the pawn on e5.
Black brought the rook to d8, and after bg5, it suddenly looks like the pawn on e7 is hanging, along with a potential fork on the two rooks. But Magnus doesn't miss such tactics. He plays the strong and logical move queen e6, cutting off any ideas of pushing e6 to break Black's pawn structure on the king side and in the center. Instead, the pawn is simply blockaded, and of course, the queen also defends the e7 pawn at the same time.
In this position, White plays queen e3, and with every move, the queen keeps creating threats. Right now, she's hitting the a7 pawn, so Black has to defend it, and does so with the simple move b6. Then Ian pushes a4, trying to open up the file, but Magnus once again finds a strong reply. Rook d5. This not only attacks the pawn on e5, but also stops the idea of a5. Now the rook has joined the game and the pawn on e5 is under pressure. Because of that, Ian had to retreat his bishop to bf4, where unfortunately it's quite passive. It's basically stuck just defending the pawn.
Magnus plays queen f5, and after queen e4, Ian offers a queen trade. But when the queen steps back to queen d7, Magnus declines. He wants to keep playing for a small initiative, mainly tied to the weakness on e5. At some point, he could even plant a rook on d4. So Ian answers with c3, controlling the d4 square, but then Magnus brings the other rook over with rook d8, fully occupying the d-file. Now the rook on d1 will never get in, Black would simply capture it. White makes a luft for his king with h3, and Magnus calmly returns the queen to queen e6, once again blockading the e5 pawn and eyeing it directly. Ian now tries to get some activity with queen a6, which may have been the hidden point behind his earlier move queen e2, but Magnus shuts that idea down with rook d3, physically preventing the queen from landing on a6. After that, Ian pushes a5, continuing to play on the queen side, trying to open up lines. Magnus replies with b5, and now White has the resource a6. Suddenly, the position becomes very sharp and interesting. The white pawn has already advanced to a6, just 2 steps away from promotion. And if White can capture the pawn on a7, things could get really dangerous. On top of that, the pawn on a7 sits on a dark square, the same color as White's bishop, which means it could easily become a target. So the position is dynamically balanced. Magnus strikes back with c5, trying to push his own pawns, but then comes qe4, and now the white queen eyes the b7 square, still threatening to grab the pawn on a7 and push the passer all the way through. Magnus, of course, doesn't allow it. He blocks and at the same time offers a queen trade. This time Ian accepts, and not without success. After the exchange on d5, White suddenly gets real counterplay connected with the advanced a6 pawn. Ian follows up with rook a5, and now the pawn on b5 comes under fire. That's why Magnus plays c4, practically the only move in the position to avoid losing outright. Black defends the pawn on b5 with rook d5, but now Ian simply brings his king closer with king f1. Magnus replies with e6, fixing almost all of his pawns on light squares, meaning they can never be attacked by White's dark-squared bishop. Still, the position is very concrete, and the key detail is that the pawn on a7 sits on a dark square, right on the same color as White's bishop. So Ian plays bishop e3, targeting that pawn and asking Magnus how he plans to defend it. Magnus finds the answer. He shifts the rook from d8 to d7, guarding a7. But now comes bd4, and suddenly White completely shuts down Black's rook along the d-file. The bishop on d4 is rock solid. It also keeps an eye on the f6 square. At this point, it becomes clear that Black's bishop isn't so impressive anymore. So Magnus starts repositioning his bishop to f8, hoping to eventually activate it along the dark squares. White plays rook b1. Now there's no longer any need to keep defending the e5 pawn. At some point, Ian is ready to push b3 and blow open the entire queenside structure. Magnus answers with bishop e7, just waiting. But then comes the critical move b3, a very important moment in the game. With this, Ian begins to open lines and prepare to invade with the rook.
And here, Magnus fails to find the only saving move in the position. Pause the video and see if you can spot the defense.
If you found it, congratulations! The move is bishop b4, a brilliant move. The point is clear. Black is trying to free his pieces and activate his rooks even by sacrificing a bishop on b4. If white takes the bishop, black replies rook xd4, removing white's strong bishop on d4. Now, for example, if white then takes on rook b5, black can play c3 and a new passed pawn appears, something you'll have to keep an eye on. Rook c5 and eventually capture on d4 with king g7 bringing the king to safety. So yes, in those lines, black may be temporarily down a pawn, but the pawn on b3 will constantly need defending, and the pawn on a6 can become a long-term weakness for white. That's why Magnus decided to go for this complex plan. Although honestly, looking at the position with human eyes, it's not obvious at first glance.
But in the actual game, Magnus played bishop d8, which turned out to be a mistake. He simply retreated, and now all of white's threats remain. The capture on c4 is still hanging, the rook is ready to activate, and sooner or later, the pawn on a7 will inevitably fall. Seeing no better option, Magnus decided to sacrifice the exchange on d4. After c takes d3, he tries to push his c-pawn forward. But Nepomniachtchi finds the brilliant move d4. Now, black can no longer play b4, and white secures a strong central pass pawn. Suddenly, the pawn on c3 is nothing more than a weakness. Magnus continued with bishop g5, not missing that the pawn on d4 is hanging. White calmly played rook c2, and now black's position is simply dreadful. The d-file is wide open, the central pawn is doomed, and white's rooks are ready to tear the position apart.
Magnus tried rook c7, still hoping to push his pawn forward. At least his bishop was controlling the dark diagonal. But white had the perfect defensive resource, rook c2. The rook blocks the pawn from advancing on the light squares, and suddenly black's bishop is completely powerless to help. Magnus pushed bishop e7, going all in and aiming to capture the pawn on b4. But white responds with the powerful d5, and if black takes, white's rook will swing into action, targeting both the b5 pawn and the queen side. Black's position is falling apart. Desperately, Magnus sacrificed with bishop b4, but after d6, white achieved a protected passed pawn on the d-file. Magnus tried rook c8, but then came rook b1, and now everything collapses. The bishop on b4 is hanging, the pawn on b5 is hanging, and the entire queen side is crumbling. At this point, Magnus Carlsen had no choice but to resign.
The game continued. Rook b1, bishop a5. Rook takes b5, bishop b6. Rook takes b6, a takes b6. a7, rook to d8. d7, king to f8. Rook to c3, king to e7. Rook to c8, rook takes d7, a8 to queen. This was the first classical game between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and leave your comments. Thank you for watching.